Welcome everybody. This is day 2 of the TFI Technology Conference. Today we have our special guest, Iain Gillott. He's going to be presenting the wireless keynote here. Iain is the founder and president of IGR, accomplished wireless and mobile industry expert. He's been in this industry for over 20 years and is quite valuable, providing a lot of insight. This session, I wanted to moderate it just because we have a lot of experience working with Iain. Not only do we live in the same city, but we also touch the same industries. As for me, I'm a managing director at Kroll. Kroll is the company that formerly used to be Duff & Phelps. Duff & Phelps actually bought Kroll a number of years ago. Kroll is a company that does primarily data-driven analysis, cybersecurity, and governance work, and we've joined forces essentially with them with our valuation side, so that we're aiming to be a one-stop shop for corporate America in general, so we can provide soup to nuts, any kind of the services that large and small companies alike will need going forward. One of you caught us right at the changeover. Today is I think the last day of Duff & Phelps, a Kroll business. On Monday morning, it will be Kroll. All my emails will say Kroll. Everything just is going to be swiped over, and all the emails will still work. So you'll see it's still working with the same team if you guys go with us, and I'm sure that we will manage this process the same. Everybody that I work with is still going to be there on Monday. It's the same team, same everything, but we're excited about where it's going to take us. We're going to have way more capabilities, way more data-driven analytics to help you guys. Well, with that said, let's kick off this keynote here. Iain, would you please take it away?
So Ruben, thanks for the introduction. The kind of new company name, when I saw it, I immediately thought you were like a Marvel character or something. Spider-Man, Iron Man, yeah. Kroll. Yeah.
Much flashier, easier to say.
Yeah. So just be warned that on Monday you may get emails like that. So, all right, let's talk about 5G for an hour. Should be a fun time. Larry had me on the agenda with just a wireless update, which I thought was kind of boring. So I titled this, what the heck's going on in 5G? Because it just seems, it's been around for a while, but it's never quiet, is it? It's never boring. So we will talk, I know there's a question about the FAA and the airlines and what's happening with C-band, and we will talk about that, as well as some other things. So what I've done here, I actually went back to the presentation I gave last year and pulled that up and went through, added slides, deleted slides. Some of them will look the same, but I've actually updated them, and I'm going to add some different things. So lots of new stuff as well. So, but if you see some familiar slides, yes, I have used them before, and yes, they are different. So let's see here. Here we go. All right. So first thing, I'm going to start out quick to talk about outlook for 2022, some more general terms, general things. I'm going to then talk quickly about what 5G is, what does 5G do, how big is it in terms of connections, and I know Ray just. And then we'll talk about macro cells and small cells. We'll talk about the C-band device. We'll get to Cloud RAN, talk about the hyperscalers, and then private networks as well. So we're going to go through quite a few different things. Let's leave the questions till the end. I'll have time to talk at the end and have questions. So and then we can jump back to different slides as we need to at that time. So number one, pretty clear here, it's in January, that COVID ain't going away. We may have wanted it to, but it just keeps coming on and on. I've always worked from home anyway, the last 22 years. But my kids are 26 and 24. Both of them have been impacted by this. My son was supposed to be going back to the office in San Francisco by now. It's just been delayed and delayed and delayed, as it has for many companies. And that does make a difference to the mobile networks, as we will talk about. It impacts where the carriers spend money and where they put cells and things like this. Our view is this thing's just not, it's going to continue to mutate, and we're going to have more outbreaks, and we're going to have waves of this. As a virus typically mutates, it does get less deadly, but it's pretty clear here that we're going to have a longer impact on office life, public spaces, etc., than probably we expected, certainly beginning of last year and definitely in 2020. The work at home trend, absolutely here to stay. Again, I've worked from home for 20 years. I always question why people went to the office. So now the ability to work from home, flexibility, work from anywhere, it's pretty clear it's going to be a dominant factor, certainly this year and longer than that. So the networks are going to have to continue to adapt, and it's really flexibility becomes an issue here. Supply chains obviously are a concern in 2021. It will be for 2022. There's no uplet in this, if you like. I'll give you a really personal example, a crazy example. I was doing some upgrades on my mountain bike, and I was at the bike store last October, looking at getting a new fork and some bits and pieces. Couldn't get one, I had to order it online. But last October, the bike store was telling me that some parts were back ordered into 2023, 18 months. And that's just for a bike. We hear from the radio vendors, especially the infrastructure vendors for wireless, severe problems. And it's okay and I say okay, it's okay for Nokia, Ericsson, the big guys who've got volume. But a lot of smaller vendors who are starting out, as we get into Open RAN, this becomes an issue. Actually getting radios today to even test with for different things like CBRS radios, for example, or in-building networks, really difficult. So it is starting to impact the ability to actually deploy solutions, and that obviously becomes a problem. The other side to this is, as you get into supply chain, there's absolutely an opportunity here for IoT automation, connectivity within supply chain, optimization within supply chain, things like this. There's a lot of companies looking at solutions to ease the problem as much as they can using wireless solutions. So it becomes an opportunity. It's also a challenge. Workforce, again, we hear about the Great Resignation. You hear about I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who's hiring people right now. They had to pay $15,000 over their budgeted allowance for a marketing person within the industry. The HR folks were screaming about this. He was like, hey, you're lucky it was only 15K. It's going to get worse. So definitely there's a lot of, there's many reasons for this, as what you can read about in many places, but basically the end result becomes that there's a labor shortage, and we do see it in the wireless industry. There's a shortage of installers and people to climb up towers. We actually did a blog on this the other day, that if you look even at the federal workforce numbers, the number of people for tower climbing has declined. And so how do we address that going forward? Putting out new networks, it's harder and harder. Automation comes into this. So, yes, I still need to have somebody climb that tower to put up a new radio or an antenna, but some of the maintenance items, some of the monitoring items, having drones fly up around towers, for example, and other things like this that save actually a truck roll to a cell site, become even more valuable to the industry, because frankly, there aren't the people there to do the driving. So you have to use automation and other tools and AI and all those good things. So there's a lot of discussion in the industry about that, and I think it's kind of interesting. Again, it presents an opportunity for the industry. Results of all this is costs are going up. Obviously, you can see it if you go to the gas pump, or you go to the grocery store, you can see it personally. But the carriers can see it as well, and the infrastructure vendors can see it. So, an Ericsson has to buy chips to put in their radios, et cetera, to sell on to an AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, Dish, et cetera. And it doesn't matter which vendor it is, it's the same problem. And so you can see that that there is inflation within the equipment. We've actually seen some vendors now and contractors starting to put pricing clauses in their contracts that basically say, yes, this is the price today, but if you don't sign within the next month, 2 months, the price will change. I was actually talking to one of the big semiconductor providers the other day, and they were talking about some of their partners were complaining that the chip prices actually went up on January 1st. And this vendor was complaining because they'd ordered them 6 months ago. I was like, well, what did you expect? You know, read the paper. So yeah, those things are impacting all the way down. And obviously, ultimately, it puts pressure on the operator's bottom line. If their network is costing more to run, costing more to build, etc., to upgrade, you know, that's going to pressure the bottom line. And obviously, there's pressure then to pass that cost on to the consumer. Oops, where's my mouse go? There we go. Oops, skip wrong way. All right, so let's talk about what 5G is. I've showed this slide before, and I just want to summarize very quickly here. It is obviously mobile broadband, the top bubble there. It's 100 megabits per user is typically what people talk about. It is low latency. That comes through different architecture changes. And typically, a lot of people talk about 1 millisecond. That's really in a very specialized scenario, usually within a manufacturing plant or something like this. Less than 10 milliseconds is actually quite doable, certainly within the macro network, certainly less than 20 milliseconds. And just to give you an idea, your LTE connection, your 4G connection today has a round trip latency of 60 to 70 milliseconds. The best I've ever seen, so I do test it on my phone, the best I've ever seen actually is about 45 milliseconds. And I was actually standing in AT&T's headquarters in Atlanta. And it was like, well, you know, if you can't have low latency and good performance in this building, you're not going to get it in any building. So that's probably the best you can get on an LTE. I've certainly never seen anything that quick. But the reason this is useful, of course, is when we go into entertainment, gaming, augmented reality, virtual reality, things like this. And then the other one is the massive IoT support. LTE, 3G, 4G do support IoT, of course, but they really treat each device as if it were a phone. And that puts a very, very big overhead on the network. What 5G does is actually supports 1 million devices per kilometer squared for IoT. So it takes the overhead out of the network to allow you to manage those devices. And that really comes with the, if I just skip to the next one, that massive IoT actually comes in release 16 and 17 as the standards. Release 15 is what we call 5G NR, new radio. That's the first version that's going in now. And that's, again, 5G phase 1, some people call it, but it's really release 15. And then releases 16 and 17 called 5G phase 2. Some people call it, we've seen advanced 5G now being thrown around. I think that's 18 and 19 releases. But 16 and 17 was actually delayed a little by COVID because the standards bodies actually couldn't meet together to actually finalize the standards. And that was back in 2020, so it was pushed back, and we now see it going in this year and next year, really into the carrier networks. But one thing that 5G is not here, it is not new spectrum. We do not define, there is no piece of 5G spectrum. 5G will go into all of the spectrum currently used, from 850 megahertz all the way up to millimeter wave. So some people say there's a 5G band, it's the millimeter wave band, those higher frequencies, and that's not the case. Just as 3G was replaced by 4G and 3G replaced 2G, so 5G is going to replace 4G. And that Ray had a nice chart on that with his the evolution of the different technologies. I know there was a question, I think it was Gary asked a question about, you know, are those the lifetimes of those generations getting shorter? The one thing I've seen that has happened, I'm not sure they're getting shorter, but they're actually getting influenced by different things as well. So if you look back at 2G, we had a lot of operators back then. I mean, we had Bell Atlantic Mobile, GTE. They became Verizon, of course. We had Southwestern Bell. We had Bell South. We had Pactel. We had Ameritech, et cetera, et cetera. So those, there was a lot of companies providing networks to invest in them, build them, et cetera, and migrate them. Now we've got 4: AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, and Dish, and a lot of rural operators. But the ones that really drive it are those 4 networks. And what happens now is, let's say the operator makes, let's say one of the operators makes a decision to disconnect or to end of life, let's say 3G. Obviously that impacts a lot of devices, and they say, okay, we're not going to support it after this time. This has happened recently in the dispute between Dish and T-Mobile with how long they're going to keep the 3G networks running to support the MVNO that Dish is using. And they got that as part of the deal with the Sprint, when Sprint was acquired by T-Mobile, et cetera, et cetera. So the courts have kind of stepped in. So actually, they're kind of artificially extending the life of a generation of technology there, which means that you've got to have vendors to support it and all these things. So when you have just 4 operators, the influences on how long a technology lives are a little bit artificial. They're really governed by some very big decisions, more so than they are when you've got a big ecosystem of carriers. So anyway, that's an aside. Where does the money come from 5G? Well, it comes from mobile broadband. You and I using our phones, and home broadband. I think somebody mentioned this morning, it was Ray. Obviously the operators stepping into that space as well. Steve's going to be happy when I say this, but I got a promotion the other day from T-Mobile, and so I've ordered their 5G home internet. Comes next week, because apparently my house is within the coverage. So I'll let you know how that goes. And I was on the call on the session yesterday when you're asking, what do people use now, who has fiber? I'm on Spectrum, and I can't get fiber at my house. So I'm kind of curious to try the wireless option here. I only have 2 options here. Obviously, entertainment, streaming Netflix down to the phone, to your tablets, etc. Advertising comes into this. Advertising was, there's actually a lot of mobile advertising happened. The operators did try and get in on this. AT&T had a group called, I think it was Xandr, which they just sold off recently. Verizon had some stuff they've done as well. They bought Yahoo, if you remember, and it was all to do with that. And they bought some other, I can't remember which platforms they bought to deliver ads. But the reality is, mobile advertising today is driven by Facebook, Instagram, Google, etc. The operators really have not been able to get into that direct, sell ads as successfully as the big social media guys have. So you can see the operators kind of moving away from that. IoT mentioned, Ray mentioned that earlier. Obviously, a lot of devices out there, more devices than people. We'll talk about that in a second. And then network slicing, we really haven't seen yet. And this is where you can take a piece of the carrier network and dedicate it to a particular application, particular service, or a particular customer. And again, that's still developing. It's something that actually comes in that release 16 and more so in 17 as the standards. So by those being delayed, it actually delayed that revenue opportunity as well. How fast is it growing? Well, it's going straight up. and actually, this curve is, you can start to see, if you look at the top end of it, around 25, 26, it's starting to level out here because we're going to run out of people to sell to, or devices to connect. So you can see the growth of the 5G connections there. That's not people, that's connections. So I have, we have a connection in my wife's car, I have my phone, I have some other bits and pieces. I have 2 or 3 connections. And I think Ray showed a percentage, 145%, something like that, penetration. But you can see we're closing in on 400 million here by the end of 2026. That's not all of the connections, that's just the 5G connections. And if you look at the right-hand chart there, you can see what percentage here is 3G, 4G. 3G is pretty much going away by next year. It's pretty much done this year. There are some devices still out there, a lot of IoT, machine-to-machine, oil, gas pipeline type valve control, things like that. The red is the 4G, which you can see is still, actually, we're still in the majority. What are we in 2022? Still about 70% of the connections out there are actually 4G. But if we jump ahead to, what is it, 2024, that's the crossover point where the majority become 5G. And then from then, it's, that 4G will start its gradual decline down. 6G I don't have on here because I'm really not that interested right now. And the reason I say that is that two reasons. One, it really hasn't been defined yet. I mean, nobody said what 6G is. There's all these concepts and ideas, but we don't have any major operators saying, yeah, we're going to put in 6G. And here's what it's going to look like, and here's what it's going to cost, and here's a device. And the second reason is I'm kind of tired of Gs. 5G is my 5th G, and I kind of promised myself that I wouldn't get to 6G. I really don't like the whole generational discussion. I think it's completely arbitrary. It confuses a lot of people. I think it was the presenter yesterday, he was talking about 10G and fiber, which means 10 gigs, not 5G 5th generation. I think they pointed this out. And it really does confuse a lot of people. So I really wish we'd get away from this and talk about releases. I'm on release 15 phone. I got a release 16. I got a 4.0 or something. I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, 5G is doing pretty well. By the way, if you go to a store today or you're online and try to buy a phone, you can't really buy a 4G phone anymore. It's really hard, actually. You kind of, all the options out there are for 5G. So. All right, so I mentioned earlier about COVID. One thing it's done is really change where we use spectrum. So we all, or you all, I didn't do it, but people used to get up in the morning, have their breakfast, hop in the car, go to the office, go out at lunchtime, work in the afternoon, drive home in the evening, go to a soccer game, football game, basketball for the kids, dance, swim, whatever. And so you're kind of moving throughout the day, but it's very predictable Monday through Friday. We knew there's a rush hour, there was a peak at lunch, and there's a rush hour in the evening. And that's gone out the window. So now we have, instead of these peaks of usage throughout the day in very specific areas, now that usage is kind of spread all over a metro area. And so it's really moved to the suburbs. But it's also distributed it. So it's much harder for the operators to predict where bandwidth demand is going to be, aside from, there's a house there. There's no predictability of the commute in all those types of things. Now, you can say, well, hang on, people are going back to the office. I've heard people going back 3 days a week. Let's take that example. It used to be people who went to the office 5 days a week. We knew Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, there was going to be a rush hour. Saturday, Sunday, there was not. Now, if you're working 3 days a week, some of you may be going Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, some of you going Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. You may vary it week to week. And so again, that predictability diminishes. We could certainly say there's some people going back and there'll be some, there's some usage patterns there, but predictability is much harder. So that capacity, a lot of it's really moved out to the suburbs. We've taught people during COVID that you can work from anywhere. I mean, you can work for Starbucks. I've known it for 20 years. A lot of people, a lot of managers didn't think you could work productively remotely. And guess what? They found out you can. I think this all comes down now to network flexibility going forward. We're not going to be looking at commute patterns here to drive, to model network capacity. And yes, we've still got those permitting issues we've talked about in the past for cells, small cells, etc. We'll talk about that as we get into this. Mobile bandwidth, it goes up. One interesting thing is, COVID caused us a lot of trouble with this forecast because, as I said, people weren't going to the office. They weren't getting in the car in the morning and streaming music or whatever. Children were not going to school and sitting in the back of the car, maybe doing something on a tablet, playing a game or or whatever, that usage shifted to the home, and where it typically is on Wi-Fi, not on a mobile network. Now we've started to see some recovery, and we are seeing people as well sitting at home in a static environment, not using a Wi-Fi connection, but actually using their mobile device. So what I've got here is the 2 lines, is the old forecast we had, and this was from a couple of years ago, which was, everything got thrown out the window with COVID because people weren't moving as much. But now it's actually gone back to more closer to what the previous forecast were. So the new forecast is that blue line, and that's the average monthly data usage. And you're going to go, hang on a second, hold on a minute. I don't use 10 gigs in a month. Yeah, you may not, but some people do. When I'm traveling, either vacationing or for work or things like this, I can easily get through 8 gigs in a month, no sweat, because I do sit in a hotel room and download something to my laptop. I don't tend to use Wi-Fi when I'm traveling. I find it slow. I also find it insecure. So I do tend to use the tethering on my phone, and I can easily use 8 to 10 gigs without a problem. My kids, no sweat. And one of the things that's done this is it is work from home, but it is video streaming, content streaming, entertainment streaming. It's also things like Dropbox. Dropbox sits on my desktop and on my laptop and does things in the background. And I start saving a PowerPoint presentation like this with a lot of graphics, and now it's being uploaded. That traffic counts, right? And so that's what counts to this. Also, we did see a big increase in bandwidth usage when Netflix moved from a standard definition format into HD format for mobile devices. They used to limit it on mobile devices, and they stopped doing that. And guess what? more bandwidth coming down. But so really, the takeaway here is COVID has changed where mobile bandwidth is consumed, not how much is consumed. The amount we're consuming is still going up. It's where we're consuming it is all over the place instead of more predictable places. Okay. So, again, we've seen mobile infrastructure investment shifting. We've seen, we'll talk about small cells here, but it's the battle for the bandwidth in the household. We talked about this before. And this has really all impacted the macro cell selection, small cells in building, the type of spectrum they go after, and things like this. I've kind of joked about this in the past, and I'm only half joking, but all of the operators spent a lot of money on that millimeter wave spectrum a few years ago. Nice big chunk of spectrum, higher band goes a very short distance. A lot of it's for dense urban areas. A lot of it has not been used. Verizon's actually sold some of it off. Because guess what? There's not the demand in a dense urban area anymore. And I think a lot of the operators kind of regret that investment, whereas the recent investments in C-band and the other 3.45 gig band we saw last year certainly is a lot more applicable to the type of spectrum we need today. Okay. Macro cells, not declining. We still need them. The carrier is trying to put more and more stuff on the tower. Just get more stuff up there. Why? Because people move back to the suburbs. The demand's in the suburbs. Towers tend to be in suburbs. Urban area has rooftops and small cells and things like this. So I don't think it's ever going to decline. I mean, the jokes in the investor industry that the tower business is the best business ever invented. But there's a consistent and steady demand for new macro cells. You can look at this in the multiples for mergers and acquisitions. Tower companies used to typically sell for 12 to 15 times earnings. Now they regularly go for a portfolio of towers will sell for 30 times earnings, 30 times earnings. And we do a lot of work talking to investors. The feeling is that's going to increase. We'll be looking at, we could be looking at 35 to 40 times earnings in the next few years for buying a portfolio of cell towers. They're very difficult to build. The zoning and planning takes 2 years. Nobody wants one in the backyard, but of course everybody complains about their cell coverage. And you can't move them. I mean, it's that real estate, it's location, location, location. So I just don't see the demand for towers here is going to decline, and I can see the carriers working how to get more and more equipment on those towers. We're actually seeing a lot of towers being upgraded right now. Literally, the physical structure, the steel, is either old enough or not sufficient. It's not strong enough to take the weight of the equipment, and so they're having to either rebuild the tower or strengthen it. That's not uncommon, and we never thought we'd get to that situation. So, okay, oops, wrong way. Small cells, yeah. 2022 was not good for small cells. The outlook a few years ago, pre-COVID, was looking pretty good, and boy, it's fallen off a cliff. There's still some deployments. The deployments we saw in 2021 were really the ones that were started in late 19 and 20 in the planning. In 2020, there wasn't many requests getting done, so that impacted into 2022. And what this will tell you is there's a delay in getting these things done. It regularly takes 18 to 24 months on the planning and zoning to get a small cell put into an area, a pole on the street and things like this. That was not the original intent. The original intent of these was that we would have, you get them done in 6 weeks. And the industry is it's nowhere close. And a lot of it's municipalities. It's been really, zoning and planning delays have been a real problem here. So these are our old and new forecasts for small cells. The number actually deployed, and we need a lot of them in the industry. I mean, there's that bandwidth demand I talked about. The old one is, just to confuse you, the old one is now the blue chart, and we were looking at let's take 2022, we'd be looking at like 1.4 million small cells out there. We're nowhere close. If we break 1 million this year, we'll be doing really, really well. And actually, this is our forecast from last year. We're actually going to have to drop this back probably a little. Now, some of you are going to say, well, hang on a minute. I just saw Crown Castle said they just signed this fancy new deal with T-Mobile for 35,000 small cells. Yeah, they did. Now read the fine print. That's through 2027. And there was no commitment to actually when those will get deployed. So what it said is that Crown Castle is going to put 35,000 small cells in the T-Mobile in by 2027. I mean, they could do them all in September of 2027 or something, right? So you've got to be careful on some of these things. There's not much good news if you're out for a small cell vendor out there. And a lot of the vendors who offer these solutions are actually kind of retooling into different things. All right, let's talk about fun stuff, C-band, right? And so you're going to see my opinion on this pretty quickly. So I just gave you some history here, and we don't have to go all through this, but basically drop down to the bottom. The carriers, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mo, Dish, spent $81 billion. They had to pay for some other bits and pieces as well. It came out to about $84 billion for a big chunk of nice spectrum. 280 megahertz sitting right in the mid-band there, 3.5 gig band. That's a lot of money. If anybody of you had to write the checks for that spectrum, it's a lot of money. But look at the first bullet. This proposed rulemaking for the FCC when C-band was first proposed was back in July of 2018. The auction was actually conducted at the end of 2020 and closed out January 15th of 2021. There's different phases for it. This is the first phase that's actually being deployed right now. So the point you're going to say is, we've known about this for a while, right? This is not new. There's no surprises here, right? So when was this stuff going to be available? Well, right now, AT&T and Verizon have turned on their C-band networks. They're actually using the phase 1 spectrum. This was the old satellite spectrum. So the satellite providers had to clear this out before the mobile operators could do that. And that clear out was completed back in December of 2021. Hence, the carriers could turn on their networks. Now, you've seen in the press about the airlines go, well, hang on a minute. We got a problem. We got interference. Our planes can't land. This issue's been around for years. This was known about back in 2018. And when the C-band was designed, they put a guard band in to make sure there were no GPS interference issues, which is what the airlines are talking about. And specifically what it is the altimeter. It's the bit that tells the plane how high it is in the sky. And so when you come into land, you kind of want to know that, right? And it really only impacts older, smaller planes with older equipment. There's not that many of them. The FCC and the carriers, I mean, there's been a lot of work done on this. Like major airlines don't have a problem. So why are the airlines complaining now? Well, I will tell you why, because we have COVID. I mean, they've waited 4 years to talk about this. They could have, this problem was known about, and yet they waited until, what, December to jump up and down and say this was going to be a problem and we should do something about it. So the answer in the short term for Verizon and AT&T has been to limit the use of C-band around airports, okay, so planes don't have issues. And I say, what a great idea. And I'm English, as you know, so this is called sarcasm. This is called humor. What a brilliant idea. So where do people want to use a lot of mobile bandwidth when they're sitting for an hour or two waiting for a plane? They want to use it at the airports, which is why people like Boingo and Externet and a bunch of others put big in-building networks into airports, and why there's Wi-Fi there and they try and charge you all this money for it. And that's why your service at the airport is typically pretty bad, because everybody else is there trying to download Netflix. So great, we've got all this new capacity for 5G and we're going to limit the use just at the place we actually need it. Brilliant. So what do the airlines want? They want money. They want a bailout. You know, what's different now from 4 years ago? Well, it's a thing called COVID. And if you look at the picture on the left-hand side here, you'll notice there's one light on in that plane. That's the person who was flying during COVID. Clearly, COVID was very, very, very bad for the airlines. They thought 2022 was going to be a whole lot better, and along comes Omicron, and you know, everything goes up in smoke again. So I look at this as an absolute blatant, you know, they're looking for Verizon, AT&T and company to give them a few more billion, and this problem would miraculously go away. And I think the cynical airlines look at this and go, well, hang on a minute, they just paid $80 billion for that spectrum. They've got a few billions left over for us. And, oh, how can we leverage this? GPS. And I am cynical enough, jaded enough to have that view that this is nothing new. This is something that was known about years ago and has been addressed many times. So, yeah, somebody may argue with me on this, but what's going to settle this? Money. Money. Simple as that. And is the FCC and the FAA at fault here? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you've got two government organizations here battling each other over this. It's kind of insane. If I were AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile and Dish, and I paid for this spectrum, I'd be going back to the FCC right now saying, well, I can't use that license around that airport. So I'm going to give it you back, and I want $300 million back, please. Go ask the Treasury for that money. I suspect if you do that, it's going to fix the problem pretty quickly. But somebody's going to have to pay the airlines off here. That's what they want. So yeah, I'm cynical. Yeah, I'm jaded. All right, where are we? Let's see. Cloud RAN. We talked about this last time. So this is where we take the, I've got a very complicated picture here. But basically, if you look on the left, there's your 4G. You've got radio at the bottom there, connected to your baseband unit. That's your baseband base station that sits at the bottom of the tower. That's connected up to the EPC, the packet core. That's the core that runs the network. And what we do with Cloud RAN is we basically split everything up. So we still have a radio. That's the 5G version on the right-hand side there. We have a radio on the tower, but now there's a DU, a distributed unit. It's a small server, sits in the tower. It probably sits at the bottom of the tower, could be in a local small data center. That connects to the CU, the centralized unit, and that's in a a data center locally in a in a city or something like this, and then it connects up to the core network, or 5G core, that CN on the top, which is the equivalent to the packet core. Now, what's different here is that my base station, my BBU, has actually got split into two functions, the DU and the CU. So I can have a very small piece of equipment, the DU, sitting out at the tower. The CU I can throw up into the cloud, right? So I can actually manage it centrally. I can be more efficient with it. It can sit on standardized hardware. So it's a very different architecture. You don't implement this overnight. This is virtualized. There's a lot of work to do this. You obviously got to replace that BBU with new equipment. And so it wasn't really something the carriers thought of doing for 4G, but when 5G came along, the idea was, well, now let's implement this as well, okay? So that's what's happened. Now, there's different versions of this. Cloud RAN means basically I'm going to take portions of my RAN, that's CU and CN, and put them on hyperscaler equipment. I'm going to put them in the cloud, okay? Hence the name, Cloud RAN, right? It's not the same as Open RAN. So Open RAN, actually, if I go back to this, Open RAN is when my DU and my CU sit on standardized equipment. They're defined in software. Whereas today, if I buy an Ericsson DU, it has to sit on the Ericsson hardware. So Ericsson sells you the hardware and the software combined, all linked, all tied together. And in fact, the DU and the CU have to be tied together as well. So it's a little bit more integrated in the Ericsson and Nokia versions versus something like Mavenir, Airspan, Altiostar, Parallel Wireless, you can go on, who do the Open RAN stuff. Now, there's been a lot, we talked about Open RAN last year, there's been a lot of discussion of this. For 2022, we were looking, I think that this is when Open RAN meets the CFO here. Open RAN is not going to be driven by the network operator, by the engineers. It's going to be driven by the CFO. Because we're looking at network savings here, 40%, and the CFO is going to drive that and make those decisions. So I think we've seen deployment so far. Dish is actually using an Open RAN architecture, but I think we'll see some of the other operators. Certainly, there's been a lot of trials. We've seen Vodafone, Telefonica internationally, Rakuten in Japan has done it. I think we'll see more of that this year, but it's really going to be driven more by the CFO's office. What does this mean for valuations for you guys? Well, Cloud RAN means you're going to use a lot more off-the-shelf hardware, not network-specific hardware. Should be cheaper. The RAN gets defined in software. The core could sit in a commercial cloud. Dish is using AWS's cloud to run its core. So Dish doesn't actually have any physical hardware for the core. It doesn't have data centers for its core. It's all running up in AWS as a managed service. They pay for it monthly. That CN, that centralized, should we see it? The CN could be therefore in a data center, but that CU, that centralized unit, could also be in a data center, which could be owned by Equinix, AWS, Microsoft, Google Cloud, not the operator. So you could have a lower deployment cost here, but then you can also get this Open RAN, you get lower costs as well. So the net result is you can see actually operators owning less equipment as we move towards this. So therefore, lower tax valuations. We tie this into edge compute as well. We've talked about edge compute before. We push more processing out to the edge. The operators have tried to do this over years. I was actually looking back the other day. I was at a conference back in 2015, back in Munich, and then the following year in Berlin on this, where the operators really trying to define this. And really what's happened now in 2020, 2021, we've seen the operators partner with the hyperscalers. And so the operators really saying, look, you guys are good at this edge stuff, these data centers, big things. We're good at radios and towers. We'll do this, you do the big stuff. And so nice pretty picture here, but you can see the cloud providers because we've got little pictures of the clouds. So AT&T, let's take them, has done a deal with Google Cloud. They've got the famous deal with Microsoft they announced last year, where Microsoft actually is taking over AT&T's core and running it. And it takes time to do these things, obviously. But basically, AT&T eventually is not going to have its own core network data centers. It's all going to be running up in Microsoft's Azure cloud. AWS has got to deal with Verizon. AWS has also got that deal with Dish. So Dish, building a new network, didn't build a core. It just went to AWS and said, can you host it for me, please? IBM's also got to deal with AT&T and T-Mobile. I think I got the color right there. I played with the color scheme a bit on this. They've got to deal with actually with Lumen. Lumen's got, it's the old CenturyLink out of Monroe, Louisiana. But Lumen's got a pretty big fiber network and also data center, cloud, and edge compute, and T-Mobile's got a deal there. So you can see really the carriers here kind of moving away from having their own big data centers running core stuff. It's not gone yet, but it's going. And that's certainly going to change over the next few years. How does that impact your valuations? Well, just what I said. Your operators really is outsourcing here those functions to the hyperscalers, to Google, Microsoft, etc. And so you won't see those, as I said, those big data centers, those big investments in those servers for the core network. Now, does this mean that an operator can run all of their network on a hyperscaler? No, it doesn't, because you still need a radio, you still need antennas, you need all that stuff on the tower, and that's 70% of a network. You're not running the radio up in the cloud, right? But everything off the tower, so we could have those centralized units, the core, those things could actually run in data centers or in cloud, not owned by the operator, but the operator just leases space in those data centers and those cloud. We can get there to do that. And I'll stress here, this is not necessarily the public cloud. This is not what you use to, search the internet or, YouTube. Put your YouTube videos up there. This is a private cloud because we need more reliability. But it's still basically the same architecture, if you like. This is not done yet, right? Dish is a good example. We haven't really seen their full rollout of their network yet. But I think over the next few years, you're going to start seeing more and more impact on valuations from this. It's certainly what we're going to see happening. Okay. All right. 2 more slides, then I'm going to wrap up. Enterprise private networks, you hear a lot about, enterprise 5G. We actually did a conference on this in November. We're doing another one in Atlanta, another one in September. We started doing conferences during a pandemic, great timing. But so we'll see a lot of developments here in 2022. AWS announced just after our conference, actually, that they were doing private 5G networks. So enterprises, they need the SIs, systems integrators, vendors to go build this, don't necessarily need the operator. And the vertical to this, education's a big one. I'll talk about these in a second. Mining, oil, gas, manufacturing, supply chain, transportation. Remember, I talked about supply chain earlier. So putting in a private network at the ports of Los Angeles, for example, to ease the pain, the congestion of processing containers is what they're looking at. And that's exactly what's happening. That's a live example there. So what you see here is really the enterprise puts in their own private network. It could be using LTE, could be using 5G. There is spectrum to do this called CBRS. They go buy radios to do this, to build the network. They have their own core and they can host that themselves, or they could put it up in the cloud, kind of like I show here. But what you'll notice is missing on this is an operator. You don't need an operator. I don't need AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, Dish if I'm the Port of Los Angeles now to put my own LTE network in. I can do it myself, and there's plenty of companies that are going to help me do it, including Nokia and Ericsson, by the way. So from your perspective, from a valuation perspective, the carrier has no involvement in these networks. There is no, just because, let's take Port of Los Angeles puts in a private network, doesn't mean that there's equipment in there from Verizon or AT&T that would affect valuations. That's not going to be happening. Fort Worth ISD, actually Dallas ISD has done this as well. There's a lot of school districts, as kids went home for COVID, to cover the digital divide, and so kids could connect, they put up private networks, completely independent from the operators. So when you hear enterprise 5G, enterprise private networks, don't start thinking your life is going to get more complicated on the valuation side as an operator. It's not. The operators do sell into that space, but actually what's typically happening is they get that opportunity from an enterprise customer and hand it off to Ericsson and Nokia, actually, who'll then go build the network for them. So it's more of a sales process, sales channel, than it is a network impact to the operator. Last slide. 5G's here. It's growing quickly. We're still rolling it out. It's going to take over everything. C-band is deployed. Now we just need to bribe the airlines. COVID has obviously changed, as I said, where mobile bandwidth is consumed and how we're consuming it. Flexibility is the issue here. Certainly the demand for infrastructure, small cells, for example, has changed. Cloud RAN and Open RAN fundamentally change how networks are built, how they're priced, how the value of them is, and that's going to obviously change the cost structure, et cetera, and we'll see more impact from that in the next few years. And the hyperscalers now in the mobile business. You talk as much about Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, AWS today as we do about any of the others. And enterprise 5G and private wireless networks can be a big focus for the next few years, but probably impact on valuations is pretty minimal, if not zero. So with that, questions?
Okay. Thank you very much, Iain. Another excellent presentation. We can throw this out to the group, although if you'd like to use the chat feature just to send it out, we'll pick it up and read it off. I wanted to just mention one thing really quick, and then I got a question of my own that I was going to ask Iain. I did find the fact that Dish is actually the fact that they're actually going through and building this network. First of all, it's a miracle. They've had how many years to do it, and how many excuses, and yet, it seems like they're coming up to the finish line. Now, of course, they've got the DirecTV thing to deal with. Can they do both? Who knows? But I'm very fascinated with Dish just because this is a true greenfield network that's being constructed from nothing. And we haven't seen anything like that in the industry for a long time. I mean, it's pretty much the big guys and that's it. I can't remember the last big greenfield type of development that took place here in the States. So this is going to be very fascinating. I mean, I think that a lot of what they're doing is they're trying to build as much flexibility as possible for as little as possible. And it seems like, all of their choices are just going down that path of how do we get it out there for cheap and to scale. So, I'm looking forward to seeing what they end up building if they do build.
Yes. I mean, I agree with you. It's kind of fascinating. It's funny you should mention it, Ruben. Most of the conversations today I have with financial guys, we do a lot of work with financial with investors, is that it's about Dish, because you said they're getting here to the finish line here, about to launch. Well, they keep moving the goalposts, because it was supposed to be in September they launched Vegas, then it was December, now it's to be determined, right? And I don't know when I'm going to get it in Austin, right? Anything like that. And yet, in the meantime, they bought all this spectrum for billions and billions of dollars, and then we just got the results of the 3.45 gig spectrum auction and who'd actually bid, and Dish was in there again for another 5-7 billion, right? So they're not letting up in their spectrum purchases, and yet they're not meeting a lot of the build-out requirements for the FCC, for the licenses on the original stuff. And they've got the dispute going with T-Mobile, and as you said, there's the questions around DirecTV, what happens with that? So there's a lot of moving parts, And, you know, Charlie Ergen's an interesting guy. You kind of want to open up his head and see what's actually happening in there, because I'm not sure anybody really knows or can work it out. But you're right, it's been a very long time since we had a complete greenfield network. The last one I can remember was actually Verizon's LTE network. And obviously Verizon was a current operator at that time. And so they really, but if you remember, they didn't use GSM, HSPA, they used CDMA for 3G. So when they went to LTE, they had a whole new build. And they literally built an entire new network overlay on their current network. Dish is doing essentially the same thing. They're building a whole new network, but they have to go get the towers and all the rest of it. So yeah, it's been huge, and we probably won't see it again, actually. You know, so
no doubt.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get to the questions here, and if you've got anything to mention, you can put it on the chat. I've got a question here. You know, the fact that you mentioned that there's pricing pressure, this isn't new. We're seeing this, you know, this huge spike in on the supply chain. We're seeing the spikes on the labor side. We're seeing the pressure in the chip shortages. You know, and for most industries, you arguably see, well, of course you're going to pass it off to the consumer. You know, McDonald's is going to make their burgers a little bit more expensive. Samsung is going to increase their prices. You know, Home Depot and Target are going to raise their prices too, to account for a lot of those things. But does the wireless telecommunication industry have the capability to raise prices?
Boy, there's an antitrust question, Ruben. Okay, so the cynical view of me would say yes, they do. You know, it's very interesting. My wife likes college football and stuff, and you know, I watched the 49ers beat the Cowboys the other day, which is very, very satisfying as a 49ers fan. I'm going to watch 49ers beat Green Bay tomorrow night. But you look at the ads, they're all insurance companies, State Farm, Progressive, right? And cell phone providers. I mean, it's like one after the other. And as Ray said in his numbers, you know, there's nobody left to sell to. So purely their marketing is to steal me as a customer, right? And so, but churn actually is very, very predictable. It really doesn't move a whole lot. So you can question how actually effective that advertising is. And the reason I mention this is because, you know, you could say, hey, you know, I'm with carrier A, carrier B is going to offer me 10% off. You know, will I move? No, it's a pain in the neck. It's an absolute pain in the neck to move. So does the operator have the ability to increase pricing? Yeah, they do, because wireless services are very, very sticky for the majority of people. There is a subset who are extremely price sensitive and do move, but they also typically tend to use MVNOs and not the main carriers, when they're using their networks, right? So I think there is. I don't think what you'll see though is that, you know, my current plan is called the, you know, Plan ABC. Instead of being $55 a month, it now jumps to 60. It's that there's a new plan that incorporates something. Maybe it gives you something for free in some way, or some other bonus, some other package. But if you look at the actual effective price per megabyte or per gigabyte, it's actually increased. And I think that's more the way you'll see it happening. But yeah, it's and it's very real. I mean, obviously we've had inflation before. We haven't had inflation like this when we've had mobile networks, if you think about it. But we've had inflation for 2-3%, right, for quite some time. The interesting one actually is the tower companies. They've got what they call escalators built into their contracts, so that the lease price on the tower does increase with CPI, with inflation every year, because those contracts tend to be 15-20 years. And so they'll build in escalators in that. Those escalators actually have proved insufficient to cover costs or to cover inflation. So so a lot of the tower guys go, well, hang on, I want to increase my escalator, and the operator says, no. We signed a contract for 15 years here. You've got your escalator. Tough luck. And so it does impact all aspects of the industry, not just the end to consumer. There's other benefits for the operator as well, if you like, on the back end.
Yeah, I do. I kind of fall back to anecdotal when I think about price increases, and I've been with AT&T for a number of years, and it feels like that price point that I'm paying hasn't really changed in the last 10 years, and I would be very shocked if they try to raise it again. But then again, it seems like every carrier has a free iPhone option, or trade in your iPhone option, and there's no doubt, because they're all stealing from each other, as you and Ray point out, that there is it seems like top line pressure is there, and only expenses are going to get worse for the big guys.
It could also come in other forms as well. So, for example, getting a paper bill, right? Mm-hmm. That's expensive. Okay. So maybe now the plan you're on doesn't get a paper bill anymore. That saves money, right? Or if you've got a cancellation fee, it used to be $200. Now it's, as I said, I'm getting this T-Mobile thing and the home internet, and if I don't return the equipment, if I cancel service, it's $370.
Yikes.
Right? Yeah, yikes. I mean, I know what that radio is. I have a hard time believing that unit is $370. But things like that, there's other mechanisms aside from the, hey, you're going to pay $50 a month or $55 a month type thing. There's other ways to do it. So
that's a good point. Yeah. And okay. So if anybody has a question, if you haven't entered in the chat, you can just hop on in. I'll give it a couple of seconds. If not, then I'll bring up a different question that I think I have here. I've got a bunch lined up just in case.
Yep. Hey, Ruben, it's Steve over at T-Mobile. I do have a quick question for Iain, and a couple of them as a matter of fact. But one you didn't talk about, maybe it doesn't really impact the carriers, but the handset ecosystem and Apple versus all others. Do you see any changes taking place, or any deterrence, being that they are the dominant player, and are they able to extract more out of carriers or put harder economics on carriers going forward?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Steve, but we're only going to allow you to ask one question today, because we spoke about this earlier. So I'm joking with you. Yeah, don't worry. Yeah, so let's be clear here. You're talking to a guy who's sitting on a Mac here, running this on a Mac. I've got a MacBook over there on my other desk. I've got an iPhone next to me. My iPad's in the office, in the house. All my wife's stuff is on Mac. The kids are on Mac. You are talking to the Apple ecosystem here, right? It's interesting when you said Apple and all other providers. Actually, it's really Apple and Samsung. LG, if you remember, is pulled out of this, right? I mean, I know there's Chinese vendors out there. Let's go, I can't remember some of the brands, but smaller. But it really is an Apple, Samsung kind of discussion. I don't. Does Apple beat up on the carriers? Sure, they do. You know that. I've seen it from small carriers, etc. Apple also needs the operators, though, right? I mean, the operators are running the networks that Apple devices use. So I can see this. I don't see that dominance ending. I mean, it is quite stunning that we're up to iPhone 13. And the format hasn't changed a whole lot, but it's still the dominant device. And it's pretty rare in technology that you see that kind of generational dominance over and over again, right? If you just think of a TV back to Sony Trinitron days, right? Philips, we used to have Philips TV when I was a kid. I mean, Sony now, you go buy a TV, there's Samsung, there's LG, there's a bunch of different devices out there that Sony certainly used to have high price devices. Now, obviously price pressure down, but you don't see that in smartphones. So that dominance is definitely there. Will we start this dominance by iPhone 20? Boy, I don't see the reason why not. The reason for buying an iPhone with us is, frankly, I've got calendar, I've got my music, I've got iTunes. I mean, boy, the effort to change to Android or something else for me is huge. I mean, huge. I'm not even sure why I'd want to do it or where to start. I do know how to do it, but why would I want to do that? I'm quite happy with my iPhone. I think a lot of people, that's the power they've got. It's not the device per se, it's the ecosystem around it. The pricing, pricing gets to be an issue. They are getting expensive. So, hey, I just don't feel, I'm on iPhone 11. I never felt the need to go for 12. 13, I may just skip 13 completely and just wait for 14. My son is on one of these upgrade plans. So I think it's, I think you're going to be with them. The question that always follows this one, of course, is, well, will Apple buy Spectrum and buy a network and run its own network? Why would it need to? Let you guys battle it out. You can do all the investing for them. You can buy the $80 billion worth of Spectrum. And I think if Apple felt the need to buy Spectrum and network, they would have done so already. They've certainly got the means to do it. And they have invested in data center and other things like this. So they do invest in infrastructure, but they clearly have not felt the need to invest in Spectrum or wireless infrastructure compared to data center. So.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, Iain.
Just for some context on the dominance of Apple, I had remembered that there was a survey that was done by Axios a few weeks ago, and it's a staggering number. It's the percentage of teenagers in America who have iPhones is 87%. 87% of all teenagers, according to the survey, have an iPhone.
Yeah. I mean, all the teenagers I know have an iPhone, all the family members. But, a lot of it is, I'll tell you what's interesting is you meet somebody who's on Android, right? And you can't use iMessage on the desktop.
Exactly.
Right?
The dreaded green text.
I mean, really, pain in the neck. So you get the teenager, the parents got the iPhone, they want to message with the kid. So of course the kid gets an iPhone. Then, another kid gets the iPhone first. So the second kid's like, hey, Mom, I need an iPhone. I'm not taking an Android, right? So yeah, it's a little cult going off out there.
It's that blue bubble cult. Nobody wants to be a green text in a.
That's right. Yeah.
In a group chat. Okay. Other questions? Thanks, Steve, for that. Let's talk about millimeter wave, Iain. And I love that you kind of alluded to the fact that COVID more than likely killed this millimeter wave prospects. But I have to ask you, I mean, is it really COVID that killed it, or is millimeter wave just fundamentally overhyped?
I think there's a degree to both. I mean, there is a fundamental need for it in dense urban. I mean, millimeter wave is very, very good at giving you big bandwidths over short distances, right? And so in a downtown dense urban area, downtown Austin, for example, it's ideal to put down at street level, rooftop, et cetera, to get super high bandwidths that we're going to need, right? It is truly horrible when you get into Westlake Hills, into trees and hills, and my neighborhood, the trees get wet, they block the signal. I mean, it doesn't work at all. So the urban canyons, the deployments that Verizon did in Manhattan were actually very good. They ran millimeter wave up and down the streets and the avenues, and then used repeaters to get into some of the alleys and things like this. And it does work very, very well. But hey, think about Fifth Avenue, right? Park Avenue, it's a straight shot and there's not a lot in the way. So compare that to a suburb somewhere like Boston. Boston's horrible for it because the trees have leaves on them in the summer that block the signal. And then in the winter, you get snow, which blocks the signal. And there's a lot of trees. So yeah, so I think in my mind, millimeter wave always had its place and had its opportunity and had the places where it made sense to deploy. And the problem is that COVID change those places. So the demand isn't there in, as I said, in dense urban. And it's not that there's no demand in dense urban, it's that there's less demand in dense urban. And that demand can be met with things that don't include millimeter wave and the cost of it, because you do need a lot of cells with it. The other thing is look at the infrastructure bill. Right up until the last evolution of that infrastructure bill, there was always fiber deployment, $60 billion worth of fiber in there, which is a lot of money. Right up until the last version, it said that you actually couldn't use that for a wireless network. And the WIA, Wireless Infrastructure Association, the lobbying got that changed. It was right at the last minute that happened. But there's clearly a move to fiber right now, certainly from the investment community. I mentioned those multiples for towers, the multiples by fiber providers as well. I was talking to a fiber provider the other day who was soliciting bids, and they were only getting 30 times earnings offers. And their investors said, no, wait. And they're going to wait a few more years. They'll probably get 35 or 40 times. So that's kind of fiber is seen as the long-term investable asset that you can profit from. And of course, that fiber to the home is competitive to fixed wireless in many cases. So we'll see what happens. I think millimeter wave is going to be interesting. There is that time aspect here as well. Is it going to be valuable in 5 years? Well, yeah, it could be, of course. It can be a lot more valuable than it is today. But operators, when you invest in spectrum, you want to put it to use as quickly as you can. And having that type of asset sitting on the books may not make a lot of sense in the long term. I think we saw Verizon, as I said, sell some off. So I'm not sure it's completely overhyped, but there was certainly some hype there, but there was an absolute use case for it as well. But unfortunately, the main use case is kind of diminished.
Yeah, no, it sure seems like as far as an investment opportunity goes, Verizon prioritized that over a mid-band solution, and it seems like T-Mobile is now out there eating everybody's lunch in the process just because they have a better network. Yeah, Steve's probably sitting there nodding. Yeah.
I'll be perfectly clear here. I got a demo T-Mobile unit 2 years ago, and I tried using it I was thinking of switching, and I couldn't use it where I am. There just wasn't enough coverage, and we tried. I was on a driving trip as well and took it, and I just couldn't use it. So it very much depends on where you are. Certainly 2 years ago it did. When T-Mobile announced the other day that they'd extended their home internet service, and in Texas they said that then expanded it to 57 cities, and I actually put in my address. I was kind of surprised. Oh, I'm up there, so that's why I got it to try it. So that's a new development. So yeah, the network's definitely improving. You could also point to the fact that hey, there's nothing better than a new network, because there's not many people on it right now. Loaded up, and of course that's what you want to do as an operator, right? You want to sell subscribers. So there's certainly, compared to where T-Mobile was 4 or 5 years ago, it's completely different. But obviously it's taken a lot of investment, a lot of billions of dollars. I know Neville Ray, his title is President of Technology or something. I've known Neville 20 years. There's a lot of work gone into that. So we'll see. Yeah. Keep us in the loop on that. See what the network comes up. We've got one more question here, and this is from Richard Sullivan, came through the chat. With respect to Cloud RAN, can you discuss a little about what will happen to the hardware currently deployed at the macro cell sites? Will new equipment at the data center conceivably be required? And if so, will that replace the hardware needed at the cell site? Yes. So the radio, okay, was it Open RAN or Cloud RAN? Open. Yeah. The Open RAN radio, Open RAN radio is different.
Richard's question was about Cloud RAN. I
Oh,
went with
okay.
open. Yeah, Cloud RAN we're talking about.
Yeah. In Cloud RAN, the radio actually can be the same. There's different, there are architectural impacts there. But it's the baseband unit, the BBU, sitting at the bottom of the tower that's different in Cloud RAN. Now, when you go to distributed, all the functionality that's sat in there's a bunch of different functions. And there's a technical chart I had last year, and I didn't include it this year. But there's a bunch of different functions that have to happen within the baseband unit. And what they do in Cloud RAN is they split that. You can split it in different things. So you can have a really small piece of hardware sitting out at the tower doing just a couple of functions. And the rest of the functions are moved up into the cloud, into a data center. So yes, you have to replace all of the baseband equipment at the tower. You cannot just say, oh, I'm going to take this piece of it and move over there. It doesn't work like that. This is not the same, by the way, as centralized RAN. Centralized RAN is when you take that baseband unit and you literally physically move it into a centralized location along with 10 of its buddies for the surrounding cell sites, put them in the same building, give them the same power supply, security, you lock them up in the same building so you don't have the physical space requirements out of a tower. But in a Cloud RAN, no, it's new equipment. And this is why the operators really waited for 5G to do this, because it didn't make a whole lot of sense to go in and put a virtualized 4G environment in. In some cases, you can upgrade it. But it's like, look, if we're going to do this, let's wait till we migrate to 5G, guys, right? And that's what's done.
Do you see, I guess to Richard's point, do you see the 5G radio getting ripped out anytime soon, or are they going to wait till 6G for this thing to go fully virtual?
Oh no, we're going to go through evolutions of 5G radios. I mean, let's take 4G. The first LTE deployment was release 9, right? The last LTE deployment was release 14. five versions. Yeah. A release 13 radio in LTE is way more efficient. It's more power efficient. It's smaller. It's lighter. It's better RF than the release 9 version was. And we're going to see the same thing in 5G. Is a release 15 radio is going to get replaced by release 18, 19, or 20 radio, right? As I said, they're talking about 5G advanced right now just to confuse everybody, and there'll be 5G advanced plus and all this stuff. But yeah, as typically a carrier touches, quote unquote, touches a cell site every 18 months to 2 years for upgrades. And that can include replacement of hardware that's just out of life or upgrades for capacity or performance. And so you'll see that over the lifetime of 5G. Right? We're still only a couple of years into this.
Right. Yeah, that's a lot of truck rolls for sure.
It is. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
With people we can't find people to drive the truck.
Yeah, there's that. Well, so we don't have any more questions.